Hi, welcome to our continued focus in ESP for police. Now, last week when we read the chapter in your textbook, our focus was really on language. What could we discover about the language of police and how the needs analysis around the language of police carried out, and what kinds of ways language was supported with the eventual coursework. Our focus today is a closer look at pedagogy. And what I really want to happen for you today with this lecture, and I want you to reflect at the end of the lecture to see if you are at this point, I want you to be able to recognize how many options you have on your menu for making instruction meet the needs of your students wherever they are at that moment. So in other words, your students are going to be somewhere on the proficiency level of English, somewhere close to or far from the objectives that you have for them for their English for Specific Purposes course. And what I want you to recognize with this lecture is how many different options you have for scaffolding up so that they can meet your objectives, or scaffolding down because they are fully able to meet your objectives and they don't need assistance anymore. And so at the end, again, I will prompt you to reflect, do you have a better sense of the many, many menu options that you have available to you to scale up or scale down your activities? So what I want to focus on is I want to first talk about reaching objectives. And I'm going to reach for the way we think of it now in K through 12 because I think it gives us something we can really hold on to and use to remind us of all the different options that we have for giving students feedback, assessing them, carrying out role plays, and introducing new information. Lots and lots of options that we have. Okay, so the first place that we're going to begin is to talk about reaching objectives. I'll give you kind of a concept to hold on to. And we're going to talk about role plays, and I'm going to directly go back to a role play that occurs in the chapter that we read about ESP for police. I'll start there and then we'll see what our options are. We'll talk about many of the options that you have for assessing learning and giving feedback to your students. Lots and lots of options. And then we'll talk about your options for introducing new information. And the whole idea is scaling up or scaling back in terms of what your students need. And so let's begin by talking about reaching objectives. Okay? So I really like the way K-12 right now is thinking about supporting students with reaching objectives. And the approach is that at any given point, students are reaching objectives. It just depends on how much assistance you're giving them. So in K-12, a 3 means that students are independently able to reach the objective that you have for them. So what does 2 mean? 2 means that you are providing some assistance. Okay? So you are providing some assistance. And the way I think about it is you're holding one of their hands. When you hold one of their hands, not literally, not physically, metaphorically, when you're holding one of their hands, they are able to reach the objective. So what would a 1 mean? A 1 means with a lot of assistance. With a lot of assistance, students are able to meet that objective. So what's a 4? A 4 means not only are they independently able to meet the objective, but they're going over and above. They are using vocabulary in ways that you hadn't even expected or needed. They are able to apply information about pragmatics in ways that you hadn't even needed or expected to. So 4 is over and above. 3 is our goal, but the reason I bring this up is because I think it's a really useful tool for you to think about that if your objective for your students, for example, for today's ESP lesson is that students are able to participate in a role play in which they are hotel front desk workers and someone else, either another student or you or guests that you've invited into the class, are acting as the hotel guests coming to the front desk. This gives you a sense that you could be meeting that objective with support, right, no matter where they are. So maybe some of your students are fully able to do it independently today. Some of your students need a little bit of assistance. Some of your students need a lot of assistance. But the idea is they are all meeting that objective, just depending on how much assistance you need to give them. Of course, this is our goal, right? This is our goal, but really because we're working with professionals, we're all hoping for a situation in which they are able to go above what even their ESP course desires of them. So hold on to this idea, and the question that you should be thinking of now is, well, what does that assistance look like? What does a whole lot of assistance look like, and what does a little bit of assistance look like? Well, let's take a look. Okay? So we're going to start by talking about role plays. By now you recognize, I'm sure, that role plays are a key element in your ESP class, because role plays are a situation in which students are able to actually carry out the authentic language that they're using with other people, either other professionals or clients, customers, guests, whatever, patients, whatever the ESP situation is. And so role plays, as you know from our previous focus on pedagogy, role plays should always look like the situation that students are carrying out in their real world work world. So for example, a lot of role plays are often one-on-one. So let's go back to that idea, the front desk hotel person with a client in front of them. So that's usually one-on-one. The client might have a family with them, but there's usually one person speaking. And so one-on-one is often a way that role plays carry out, but it doesn't always have to be. A role play might be if you are preparing someone who's going to work in a school and will have often meetings with parents and children, for example, then the role play would probably have a group of 3 or a group of 4, maybe 2 caretakers plus the child and the person who you're preparing for the work world. It could also be that some of the role plays that you're carrying out with your students, often people have to conduct meetings or be a part of meetings that are carried out in English. And so you would want the number in the role play to match up with the realistic number of people who end up in a meeting in that situation. So if it often tends to be meetings of 4 or 5, you would want role plays of 4 or 5. So just remember that role plays are not what you can dream up in your mind, but they need to be directly connected to the work world situations that your students end up carrying out English. So let's talk about, when we go back to this idea that students might be able to meet the standard completely independently, or they might need some assistance, or they might need a lot of assistance. Let's talk about how you can ratchet up or ratchet down a role play for your students. Okay. All right. All right. So I've got, and it's kind of hard to see, I can see now, I've got kind of a spectrum from, it might be hard to see, this says more support and less support. And this kind of matches up with, if you think about the 1, 2, 3, 4, that kind of thing. So we're moving from meeting that target independently to getting some support to getting a lot of support and being over and above. Maybe 4 is more like here, right? Yeah, something like that. Okay, so here are kind of the hinge points, the pressure points that I think you can either provide your students with more or less assistance. So the first thing is around strategies. So if you're having your students do role plays, you could provide them with lots and lots of support around strategies by reteaching the strategy that you believe will be most effective for them for the role play. So you could reteach it right before they do the role play. You could have environmental print up in the room reminding them. They could actually have a handout or some kind of resource that they're holding on to that reminds them to carry out the strategy, to use the strategy. Or independently, you could just not even remind them of the strategy, and they simply, when they come into class, you have them carry out the role play. And this would be a chance for you to find out, are they remembering those strategies that you've taught? Are they putting them into use even without nudging? So what might a 2 look like? A 2 might look like before the role play saying, okay everybody, what's the strategy we've been working on over the last couple of weeks? Okay, good, you remember. So remember what it looks like is, and then just a little bit of nudging. So 2 would be with a little bit of nudging. 1 would be with a lot of support, maybe environmental print, a resource, complete reteaching before the role play. 3 is independent. 4, what would 4 look like? 4 would look like not only did you not remind them, but they do an amazing job applying the strategy. Not just adequately, but just kind of over and above, okay? So that's one of many hinge points that you have for ratcheting up or ratcheting down the challenge of a role play for your students. Another is around modeling. So right before a role play, you could provide a model, you and someone else, either a student who's very, very strong in the class, or a guest speaker or another teacher, maybe a stakeholder, right? Maybe, for example, if you end up teaching as I have, when I've guest taught in Nicaragua with hotel workers, we were actually in a hotel room right off of the lobby, so kind of a small conference room. And I didn't in my guest teaching, but the regular teacher would from time to time in the morning as he met guests, he would bring them in, ask if they'd be willing to come in and do role plays with the students. So you could start out with modeling and providing a really excellent model, so that's you and someone else. And you could also talk through the model in terms of telling the students, you know, here's what was great about it, here's if there's any pieces that could have been improved, how they could have been improved. Or you could elicit that from students, get them to say to you, okay, what was great about it? Was there anything about it that could be improved? So one way that you could provide assistance for students, if they're not ready to do that role play completely independently, is you could carry it out in front of them and point out a few things. Or they could see several models and there could be extensive discussion, maybe even you're writing up on the board or you're writing on any environmental print that you have access to. Maybe you've got those big sheets of Post-its that you can get from Office Depot. I've used those in Nicaragua, and you're putting those up on the wall. So a 3 would be the students are able to carry out the role play completely independently. They don't need to be reminded with a model of what it is that they're shooting for in their goals. 2, They're watching a model, they're seeing it right before. A 1 would be a lot of discussion about what makes that model work. And so one thing you can see is that when you're introducing an objective to your students early in the process, maybe week 1, you're probably doing a lot of this, and then it's moving to a 2, and then maybe week 3, depending on how often your class meets and how many hours you have with them and how close they are to meeting the objective, maybe they come in one day and they're put into groups and they role play fresh. And so there's none of this reminder. And then you would find out, are they able to meet the mark, meet the objective without that assistance? Okay. Another element that's related to modeling is how much planning or how much practice are they given right before the role play? Planning means how much time they have to kind of think through what they want to say, reminding themselves of the vocabulary, the functional language, reminding themselves of how to apply the strategies, reminding themselves of the pragmatics or the sociolinguistics of the situation. And then whether or not they're able to practice that model with another student before they get up and do it in front of the class, or before they present it to you. Maybe the rest of the class is carrying out some other activity, and one by one students are carrying out their model for you, and you're giving them some kind of feedback. So be thinking about how much planning time you're giving them, and whether or not they have a chance to practice before the real thing, whether that's in front of you, in front of a guest, in front of the whole class, whatever that is, or in front of a video, if video is an option in your class. So planning time would be reflection time. It might be individual. It might be a student just thinking by themselves. It might be a dyad, 2 students, or whatever that magical number of the role play is. Maybe the magical number is 4, because that's the number of people who often end up in these kinds of conversations in the real world. How much time they have as a group to plan, to think about the vocabulary, the functional language, etc. And then whether or not they have a chance to try it out before they try it out for real, in front of you, in front of the class, in front of the video, whatever it is. Okay, so a 3, to do it independently, would be there's no planning time and there's no practice time. Because in the real world, in the work world, there is no planning time, there is no practice time. 2 would be maybe with a short amount of time for students to plan and practice. And 1 would be maybe that was their homework for the last class period, to think through and to plan. And maybe when they walk into class, the first 10 minutes of class, they have a chance to work with another student who will be their partner in the role play to actually practice it beforehand. So what would a 4 be? Not only are they not given any assistance at all, no planning time, no practice time, they simply do it fresh, but they do an amazing job. And they're actually bringing in professional pieces, functional language, application of pragmatics above even what you expect of the students at this point. Collaboration. Collaboration is connected with planning and practice in terms of, do students have a chance to work with other students before the role play? And so collaboration could happen with the entire class, right? So maybe you say to the class, okay everyone, we've been working towards doing role plays of, and I'm just going to keep coming back to the hotel piece for the moment. We're going to keep coming back to the front desk person meeting with a hotel client. And so in 15 minutes, we're going to carry out role plays. I will randomly partner you with another student. Until then, you've got 15 minutes to talk as a group, remind each other about what these kinds of conversations look like, what the language looks like, the grammar looks like, remind each other of any pronunciation that you've been struggling with, and to plan out a little bit as a group. So the collaboration could look like that, or the collaboration could go back to the person or the people in the class that they're going to be doing the role play with. So is it completely independent, or did they have a chance to work with others to plan out? And I'm sure you can see that when you're first introducing an objective, an activity, which would be a language use activity, you want the students to be able to carry out in their work world, you would be giving lots of chances for collaboration. You would be doing lots of whole class work and group work and small group work and pair work to support them. A 2 would look like maybe a short period of time to collaborate in some way, and a 3 would be fresh. There's no collaboration time at all. They're simply able to do it independently. Okay? The use of resources. The use of resources. So one thing to keep in mind is that there's 2 kinds of resources that we're talking about in ESP classrooms. One kind of resource are the actual, the realia, the actual types of documents that, or real objects that people in this profession use. And so there's that kind of resource. But what I mean here are the supportive teaching resources that you're giving students, or you're putting up in your room, or you're putting up on the board to remind students of things that they can do or carry out or remember to support their role plays, to support their actual work dialogues that they're carrying out. And so what this responds to is the teaching resources. How many teaching resources are you providing to students so that they can carry out the role play? So with a 1, you would not only provide them with lots and lots of resources, the kinds of things they wouldn't necessarily have access to in their work world, but you're reminding them to use them. Maybe you're even walking around the room and nudging students, hey, don't forget, look up at the board, remember to use that vocabulary. 2, the resources, the teaching resources are available, but you're not really nudging them to use them very much. 3, no teaching resources. It's just like in the hotel or in the police station or when a police person pulls someone over. So it matches up with kind of that independent, no resources available, teaching resources, and the student is able to do it. So that's what I mean by resources, not realia. Realia, anything that people would have access to in the real world, that is always welcome. That's not necessarily a support. Although you and I both know that whenever we have another channel of communication available for us as language teachers, that is always its own kind of support. So for example, if in their real world work, your students, when they're employees, there are certain forms that they have clients or patients filling out. Having those available to express themselves, technically they're not a teaching resource. They are an actual resource, actual realia from the work world. And they could learn to support what they're saying with those. So maybe they're really struggling with clear pronunciation of saying, could you fill this out, please? Maybe there's lots of sounds in that sentence, or they're really struggling with the intonation. It's hard for them to make that clear. If at the same time they're saying that, they are handing the form and a pen to the client, that will help support their expression of meaning. Okay, so that's a little bit about resources. And then repetition. And so repetition can mean back to modeling. How many times do students, before they're carrying out the role play themselves, how many times do they see this modeled in front of them? Or how many times do they see student models around them? So for example, if I'm going to be a part of a student dyad, meaning 2, giving a role play in front of you, the teacher, how many times do I get to hear it and see it before it's my turn? And so that makes you realize, for example, that even the way you call on students can be a scaffold. Calling on the strongest group first can be a scaffold for the third group or the fifth group or the last group. And so that's another way that you can almost invisibly scaffold for students. And so some of you call on that group that you know, they are at a 3 or a 2, and you're very specifically not calling on the groups that are at a 1. You're not calling on them first or second. You're letting them take in more modeling, and they're getting more repetition. And then, of course, repetition can mean how many times the student themselves get to do it. So, for example, a student who is at a 3, they are able to, without any repetition at all, they are able to meet the standard. That's very different than a student who needs more repetition. And so what you could do if your students are at a 2 or they're at a 1 is you could have everyone get up and they find the other person who has the same color of card that they do, and that is the person that they carry out their first role play. And then when time is up, you tell them, okay, now you need to find a new partner that you haven't worked with yet, and that is your second role play, and you continue going like that. So even how many times you have students carrying out that role play, that is another way to scaffold up or scaffold down. Now, before we move on from role plays, what got me thinking about this particular topic was in your textbook in Chapter 5, looking at the ESP course with police, there's a wonderful, I think, a wonderful role play in which there's some kind of crime that happens, and police come in, they interview, and they take witness interviews, they take witness information, and then they create some kind of written report. Now, the first time I saw this particular kind of role play was not connected to ESP at all. I was at a conference, an ESL conference, and someone at Highline Community College who regularly uses this with this particular role play, she uses it with her beginning students and her low intermediate students. Now, she wasn't preparing people to be police or witnesses, crime witnesses either. So why in the world might she have been using this? She used it because students needed to use the past tense, and students needed to use descriptive language, lots and lots of adjectives to describe what occurred. And the way that she did this role play is she would ask for some volunteers from the class, just a few, take them out in the hallway, tell them what she wanted to do, and she even had very simple written directions for each person. And I at the conference, I participated in this, so my script said something like, put on the blue hat, and when someone puts a bag in front of you, pick it up and put it in the trash. So it was very simple. I didn't know the entire role play, only what I was supposed to carry out. And then there were 2 volunteers who were supposed to be the police, and they were not in the room when this action carried out, this crime. And so then students were put into groups, and they were supposed to come up with what did they think happened. And then police came in, not real police, students pretending to be police, and they had to listen to what the group said and create a written report. And then all of that was put up on the overhead so that we could see it. And of course, what did we see? Past tense, descriptive language. So I really wanted to highlight that role play. It's fantastic. It really could be a model of the kind of role plays that you create for your students that directly gets them ready to carry out what they need to do for their work. But I wanted you to notice that there's not a whole lot of detail given to us about how to carry out that role play And now you can see you have lots and lots of options to ratchet up or ratchet down a role play like that. Okay, so what have we talked about so far in this lecture? We've talked about different way we can see reaching objectives. We've talked about the different menu of options that we have, those micro choices that we have in our teaching around role plays. Let's talk about some of our options for assessment of learning and giving feedback to students. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. All right. So, I'll probably regret erasing that in a moment, but for expediency, let's take a look at this. So again, I'm suspecting that you may not realize how many different options you have for assessing students and giving them feedback in an English for Specific Purposes class. And so this is just kind of my brainstorming of some of those different options I want to make sure that you know are in your back pocket. One thing that you can use is an entry task. And you could use an entry task, so when students are coming in, especially if you're working with occupational students who work right before your class, you might have people kind of staggering in at different times. I say staggering meaning at different times, not that they're incapacitated. And so for your entry task, to kind of give students something to do as you're waiting for the rest of the class to show up, you might have them do a bit of self-assessment. Now, really, self-assessment actually can help your students notice where they are in their learning. So self-assessment, in my opinion, can be feedback to students because you're getting them to pay attention to a certain aspect of their learning and getting them to reflect on where they are. But you could also, for the entry task, have them carry out some kind of task. So for example, back to our focus on ESP for police, if your focus or one of your focuses in your ESP for police class is around writing, and maybe you've been working on writing reports using past tense correctly, maybe they walk in and they see a scenario up on the board and they have to turn that into a short written report. And so you could collect those when it's time for class to begin or shortly after class has begun. And there you've got some evidence about where they are in their learning. And then of course, what would you do? You would give them feedback on that. You'd collect that, and either that same class period or at the next class period, you would give them some feedback on that. And what does feedback look like? It's really important that feedback points out what students need to do to take that next step. And so that entry task can be a great way to do that. And notice that down here at the bottom I've got exit tasks, so you can do the very same thing before students leave. You can, for example, if you've been working in your ESP for police class, maybe you've been working on if your students are struggling with saying some of the vocabulary around police work, and it's actually a pronunciation issue, then you could quickly pass out some of those keywords that they need to use in their police work that have some of those troublesome sounds in them. Tell them to turn to a partner, practice with a partner, get some feedback, and then to leave the classroom, they need to hand you the word and say it to you clearly. So you could have an exit task. It could be self-assessment, but maybe better yet, it could be carrying out some element, even if it's a small element, like pronouncing one word that they need to carry out to leave the classroom. You could also have a student-led model. So you could have students, going back to the role play idea, you could have students go to the front of the room and they carry out a dialogue that they create themselves. And you could actually be silent and ask the rest of the class to give them feedback on what did they do well and what do they need to improve. if you think about it, if you've got two students at the front of the room, you're getting a sense of what they can do, but if you're not the one giving that feedback, if the rest of the class is, you're also getting a sense of what the students can see as a group, what they're noticing, what they're not noticing. Of course, you can have student-led model carry out their role play, and then you're giving them feedback. And so the rest of the class they're getting indirect feedback because they can imagine themselves carrying out that dialogue, and then they can imagine that you're giving them the same kind of feedback on their actions, on their role play. You could also provide a counter model. And a counter model means it's not a good example, it's the opposite of a good example. And so you could, for example, enlist the help of a stakeholder, or you could enlist the help of another teacher. You can enlist the help of anyone that you can grab and bring in, and make sure with them that they understand that you're going to be giving a purposely bad example to your students, and carry that out in front of students, and then ask them for their critique. What do they notice is a problem with that? And that can happen in a lot of different ways. You could have the class as a whole provide feedback right there, or you could have students turn to a partner and talk about it. You could form small groups, have the small groups talk about it, and then talk about it as a whole. So lots of different options there. And of course, what are you able to assess from that? You're able to assess if the students are picking up when strategies are not being used well, if language is not being used well, if pragmatics are off, etc. Okay? And while we're speaking of bringing guests into the class, one option is to bring a guest stakeholder into the class. So you could, for example, have someone, just a member of the public who could or could not be pulled over by a policeman, for example, if they were speeding, bring them into class and play a video for them and have them talk to the class about whether or not they think the police were appropriate, were they polite, were they being professional, that kind of thing. So that would be a low stakes kind of way for students to get feedback on what is good or bad police behavior, professional or not professional behavior. Slightly higher stakes would be if hold on.